Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for the opportunity to present. I wanted to make an addition to what Justin finished with. Make sure when you take the one you're seeking for mentor out, you pay for the coffee. Right? All right, so it is a hard act to follow, so Justin did a really great job. I have a lot of information because I do think there's a lot to share with you on this topic. Hopefully I won't overwhelm you. All right, so learning objectives. We'll talk a little about effective grant writing strategies, and we'll also focus on avoiding mistakes and what mistakes to avoid. I don't have any disclosures. My presentation mainly applies to quantitative studies. However, there's a lot to be learned also for qualitative research. You heard that distinction by Dr. Demek. So what is a grant? I think you're all familiar with this, but it's essentially a sum of money that somebody gives you to finance research, right? Why do you need it? For a lot of the things that Justin mentioned, many institutions, academic institutions, obviously, it's important for promotion and advancement. But if you think about this realistically, and if your passion is doing research, you need the means to do it, and money typically is what you need. How do you write a grant? You tell them, give us the money and we'll all win, right? But I would argue that you need these attributes. You need motivation and passion. You need an interesting idea, and you saw a number of ideas presented by Dr. Demek in the previous presentation. You need some writing skills that maybe you can borrow from somebody else. You definitely need time. You need the resources. You heard a lot about this also previously. And I would argue one of the most important aspects is you need to be persistent, and I'll explain. So when you plan your application, you really need to make an assessment of your field, and this ties really nicely into Dr. Demek's presentation. You need to identify what is it really that you're interested in. Talk to your colleagues, brainstorm with them, identify important research questions. Yes, if you are a clinician, you probably know you may have some good ideas that because you encounter them in practice, and that's a big benefit. But you can also check the literature. There's a number of, the one good thing, years ago when I was early in research, I was always thinking, oh, I'm going to run out of ideas. Well, actually, I find out that the more research you do, because every research you do will lead to additional research. It will open new questions, right? So a lot of papers, if you read them, in the end, they will typically identify what else needs to be studied. And that can be a source for you to look for if you lack ideas, which I'm sure most of you don't. Assess, that was described very nicely to you. Assess your personal strengths and weaknesses, your environment, where are you? What can you do with what you have, right? If you don't have zero resources, yes, you can do a project that you study perhaps some attitudes, as was mentioned, and that can still get you to where you want, and until you are able to get the resources later on. Identify who you're going to go after for money. You heard Dr. Demek mentioning shopping around. That's really what you may need to do. You may want to contact the agency officials. Ask them, do they have an interest? Talk to them about what you're thinking about doing. Do they have an interest in something like this? Because if they don't have really an interest or they don't sound encouraging, don't waste your time putting something good together to submit to them. Find somebody else who may have an interest in what you do. That's not unlikely. Find out what is it they are interested in. But I would argue that, especially at the beginning, you want to go for something you have a passion for. Don't do something that, because an agency is funding, that you think they will get. Because if you lack passion, it's not very likely you're going to get in. You may want to find out who are the people who are going to assess your work, what criteria are being used, because those criteria are really the most important, and you need to target those criteria of evaluation of the grants when you're writing the grant, because that's what the people will be judging you on. find out submission deadlines, get familiar with the application format. If you can get your hands, if you know where you're going to submit your grant, and you can get your hands on a successful grant that was submitted to the same funding agency, that would be great. Don't copy the grant, that would be a fatal flaw, right? But it can help you get a good idea of what it needs to look like. Very important, the time commitment. You need to understand that this is not a process that you can do over a day or two. This is a long-term commitment. It takes a long time to get to a big and good project. You cannot do it last minute, as I'm probably the most guilty of. So you may need time to collect preliminary data. Most big grants require this. If you don't have preliminary data, you're not probably going to get far. You need some time to get approvals, RB, Cook. You need time to write the grant. You need time to have people look at your grant. You need time to, from the time you submit to the time it gets reviewed and gets back to you, it takes a while. So generally, it may take about 9 months from the time you submit to the time you get the message whether you're going to get funded. But it takes probably another at least that long as you're thinking and writing it. So it's a long time commitment that you need to plan for. And that's maybe what you need to look like when you're doing this, right? So these are the components typically of a grant. There's a project summary or an abstract. There's a background and significance where you state the problem, etc., and present your preliminary results. There's a hypothesis and specific aims. And then you go into the design and the methodology. You provide the budget, assurances, and then you describe yourself. And I wanted to bring to your attention the evaluation criteria that the NIH uses. And the importance of this is because it will orient you a little about what you need to address. Yes, you may need to follow this outline, but really what they're looking for are these elements, right? So these are the elements you're going to be evaluated upon. Every reviewer every NIH reviewer that looks at your study will be completing these aspects, and they will give you a rating on these. Granted, so we're not only talking about the NIH, but it's a good starting place just because they have really good standards, right? So keep that in mind, because if you can address all of these aspects well, then you're going to have a lot better chance for success. So when we talk about the project summary, it's a brief description essentially of what you want to do, but you need to address all the elements, or most of the elements I mentioned earlier. So brief background, hypothesis, what is unique about your project, what's the action steps, the methodology you're going to follow, what you expect to find, and how you think your results will affect the field, right? The significance aspect. So be brief, but you have to be complete, clear, and enticing. By definition, you'll have to use all the space provided for this. Typically, this will be up to 1 page, just because there's too much information you want to fit in there. Don't use half page. That doesn't look good, typically. And I don't think you will, because there's too much things that are hard to make in this compact format. But this is the 1-page advertisement. This is the first thing people look at, right? If it is not well done, it will leave a bad impression. And while you cannot win the grant with this page, you may be able to lose it, right? So make sure you pay a lot of attention, you polish this very nicely, because that's what most people will look at. So then you go into the background and significance, right? So you describe why you're doing the study. Why is it important? And why is it worth doing it? What's the problem? So we don't do research to do research. We do research to address a problem and have a meaningful impact. What is the problem? And you have to convince others that this is a real problem that impacts many people, and which is the rationale why you need to study, right? You need to convince others, you need to study this because it's an important issue. You need to demonstrate in this section that you know what has been done around this problem already. That's where you review the literature and describe what has been done, what has not been done, and why the problem you have identified has not been well addressed, so you're the one who needs to address it. What gaps will your research fill? What will it address? And why is it unique? So I showed you in the previous image that innovation is one of the aspects. So why is innovation one of the aspects of evaluation? Well, because nobody likes boring proposals, right? They want to see something different. They want to see something that will push us to the next level. So you can do it to make you look good, but there's more to it, right? So make a compelling case for your proposal. Why is it important? Master the existing literature. Do not forget to quote people who have published in the field and they're experts, because they're likely going to be your reviewers. And typically what happens if an expert reviews your grant or work, or paper for that matter, and one of the first things they will do is they will go back to the reference list to see if you reference them. And if you don't, you're not going to do well with that review. Promise. Justin, tell me you don't do that. Okay, good. I'm not the only one then. Okay. So highlight the applicability of your findings, right? Stress what is strong about your proposal. Describe your prior work with a subject, and this is the preliminary results, right? It demonstrates that you're able to do this. You've done it on a small scale. Now you're asking for money to do it in a big scale, but you know what you're talking about. It's not the first steps you're taking in this, because everybody who's more familiar with research, who's done some research, knows that what you typically plan initially never ends up being exactly what you end up with. Right? You can plan as much as you want. You can be the most OCD person that has everything in place. It will not work out as you were imagining it. That's reality, and that's fine. But that's what pilot work will help you with, because pilot work will tell you what you didn't think about and what wasn't exactly what you were expecting. But now, when you go for the next step, which is the bigger funding, you know to address those issues. And that's why it's important to have this. It demonstrates the feasibility of the feasibility of the proposal and the fact that you can do it because you already have that preliminary experience. So this is just another funny thing, but essentially it's supposed to work like you write the grant, you have the money, do the research, but it indicates that sometimes actually you have done the research and then you get the money to do the next research project. Because the reality is, the reason I put this up is one of the challenges with grant funding, you have to do a lot of work before you submit. You do not get compensated for that work. You cannot request money for that work you put in to get the grant. All the money comes for what you're going to do after you get the grant, right? So you need to have ways to support yourself when you do all this work. So a few tips about this. Summarize the critical findings of your work, right? That supports what you want to do. So oftentimes what you will see with grants is you do some preliminary work that supports the problem you're thinking exists. You find some evidence that, hey, here's the problem, I did this, identified this, actually really significant, and that's why I need to do this research. If you've published something on the topic, even more important to include that. So plan ahead, I mentioned that earlier in the timeline, you need to have that work done before you get to submitting. Convince people you're the one to do this, as I mentioned. So the hypothesis describes the what of your proposal. You have to be concise and realistic in what you want to do. It's the main idea, right? And you have to address also the long-term goals and the specific time-phased objectives. So you need to be clear in your hypothesis. You cannot state an objective when you're supposed to be stating a hypothesis, and many people confuse this, right? So when you state a hypothesis, typically you will have to compare two things. That's really what most comparative research is about. When we go into quantitative research, that may change for qualitative research. You have to include some specific aims and focus on the things you really have a lot of expertise and evidence and pilot data and knowledge about, because that's where your strength lies. So if the hypothesis is, if you observe the pot, it will eventually boil, I mean, it needs to be clearly stated. So the design and methods, this is how you're going to do this, right? Who you're going to do it with, what you're going to involve, when you're going to be done, what's the timeline. It's the most critical component of a grant. This is essentially where reviewers spend the most time in, because that's really what makes or breaks a proposal most of the time. So you have to be very detailed in how you're going to accomplish what you propose, what your timetable is. And I do think it shows a lot of maturity if you indicate what are the potential things that may go wrong and how you're going to address them. Because as I mentioned, all seasoned researchers know that research doesn't typically go as planned, right? So you need to know how, you need to demonstrate potential problems and how you're going to address them. It is very useful if you include some type of algorithm, a graph of methodology. What Dr. Dimitrios showed in the previous presentation, the slide, as you saw Dana's slide, he had a really nice graph. It is visually very pleasing and helps you understand what you're trying to do, the reviewer. Because don't forget that a lot of the reviewers are busy people. They may be reviewing this in the middle of the night, or I would say likely they're going to be tired. If they have a hard time understanding what you're writing, it's not going to end up well for you, right? If you make it easy for them to really understand what you're trying to do without having to put too much thought into it, you're already winning. Cite, as I mentioned, publications that support what you're doing, ideally from you, or ideally from experts in the group that may be your reviewers. Don't forget to include controls, if appropriate. Explain why you're choosing one approach over a potential other, right? We talked about pitfalls. And why choose your collaborators well so that where they supplement your expertise. Make sure the timetable is reasonable. I want to make a point quickly about power analysis. And the reason for this is because, especially for SAGES grants, where a lot of you submit, we see this often being a problem. So the power is your ability to detect a difference when a difference exists, right? And it helps you to avoid false negative studies, which is also known as type 2 error, which is kind of the big menace of surgical literature, if you look at it carefully. So let's say we have this study. You compare intervention A versus B, and you're going to do a randomized trial, and you're going to have 25 subjects in each group. And the outcome of interest, complication X, happened 3% in group A after you do the study, and 6% in group B, which was your control, let's say. Okay? And that significance was not different. So you conclude there's no difference between the interventions. So is there a problem with this design? What's the problem? There's about 100% difference between the groups, right? 6 versus 3%. While the percentage may be small, the relative difference is huge. So for you to be able to really say that there wasn't any difference, you probably would have needed about 5,000 people in each group. So your study has a fatal flaw that cannot be corrected unless you go and enroll another 4,000 plus patients. So that's why it's important to do the power analysis ahead of time, because it will help you determine if it's really worth going through the process of putting a grant to investigate this particular issue when there's no hope that you'll ever get it in your environment, for example. And reviewers of important grants will pick up on this and look for this. So then of course, you have the budget and the justification where you present and justify the expenses. I'm not going to take much time on this. I'm running out of time, but you have to be realistic. You have to identify, you have to justify the budget, why you're using the money you're using, right? Calculate effort and salaries. An example that tends to be confusing to many of you early on. So you have to essentially bring down, to understand what that means is you have to consider the week having 40 hours, It's not a surgical week, obviously. 40 hours, right? And each day is 8 hours. So each day is considered 20% effort. If you have to do work on the grant 1 day a week, you're spending essentially 20% effort. And then you take your salary and divide it by 5, because your salary is supposed to cover the whole week, or whoever is doing the work, right? Their salary divided by 5 if they're going to be spending 1 day a week on the project, and that's how you calculate the effort and the salary. You have to have assurances, and then of course you have to have the appropriate qualifications and the resources. If you do not have the qualifications you need, find collaborators who can strengthen your application, right? Or who can supplement your expertise. Or obviously, if you're not there yet, don't start with the NIH. Don't start with R01, which I don't think needs saying. It's very important to write it right? Because sometimes, oftentimes, especially with smaller grants, there's a lot of mistakes. And if there are mistakes, as a reviewer, if I see grammatical mistakes, that's already a warning sign that says that you don't pay attention to the detail, and if that's the case, you're not going to do a good study. So you're already losing a lot of points if you haven't made sure that your grant is very well written. So proofread your grant. Once you've written it, proofread it again, and have somebody else proofread it for you as well. So have a hook, have a clear plan for your project, think through what you're doing very carefully, highlight the impact of your study, convince reviewers that that the problem you're proposing really needs to be addressed, and you're the one who needs to do it because you already have done some work on this and because you really understand it the best than anybody else. That's what you need to convince the reviewers. Don't work alone, right? So seek advice and help. Get mentors to help you, especially at the beginning. Get people to help you with the writing who have expertise in this. Get people to supplement your the areas that you need expertise. Do your homework, know exactly what is needed, get letters, etc. early on. Seek criticism, and if you can, become a grant writer. Reviewer. Because that will give you an idea how to do this from the inside. If you cannot, the next best thing is become a reviewer of papers for a journal, because that will also show you, give you a better understanding how to write papers, because papers and grants, they're not that different really in their construction. So, and if you get rejected, don't do a harakiri, right? Because the reality is, you need to really learn from this. There's a very foolproof formula. If you follow this, you will always get funded. But in the absence of this, you need to be aware that the greatest barrier to your success is your fear of failure. If you don't try, if you don't fail, you will not learn how to be successful. We all have gone through plenty of failure. Maybe Dr. Dimitrios had never failures. Never, right? So we all have gone through many failures to get to success. And that's the way this game is played. It's not any different than surgery. The more you do a procedure, the better you get at it. The more you write grants, the better you will get at writing grants. Because the criticism you get back every time will help you get better the next time. So the successful application, I'll finish here, is clear, precise, easy to read, proposes an enticing idea and testable hypothesis with significant scientific merit, has a detailed, easy to understand and feasible experimental design, and has the potential to lead to further studies or funding, and is free of errors. I want to thank you for your attention, and sorry I went over my time, but Justin helped me with this.